A 37-year-old father and his baby boy disappeared into the dense Mississippi swampland during a traditional duck hunt. The case went cold almost immediately, leaving their family in an agonizing limbo for 2 long years without any answers. The silence held for 2 years, broken only by a maintenance diver's discovery in a deep channel, an object that had been deliberately concealed and held a sinister secret the swamp had been forced to keep. The Mississippi swamps swallow the light. On November 14, 2015, the fading sun didn't just set. It seemed to dissolve into the murky water and the dense canopy of cypress trees. Juniper Kincaid stood at the edge of a remote boat launch, the gravel crunching under her feet, a sound too loud in the oppressive silence. It was 7 p.m. Her husband, Willard Kincaid, 37, and their 1-year-old son, Thatcher, were late. Not just hunting late, where time bends around the flight patterns of the ducks, but hours overdue. The air, thick and humid even in the autumn evening, hung heavy. The familiar sounds of the day, the distant pop of shotguns, the hum of boat engines, had ceased, replaced by the whine of mosquitoes and the unsettling splash of unseen creatures beneath the dark water. Juniper pulled out her phone again. The screen illuminated her face, highlighting the tension around her eyes. She dialed Willard's number. It went straight to voicemail. Again, she tried to rationalize the silence. The swamps were vast, a labyrinth of channels and reeds where cell service was notoriously unreliable. But Willard knew these waters intimately. He was meticulous about safety, especially with Thatcher. He had promised to be back before dark. Unable to stand still, Juniper climbed back into her SUV. She began to drive the muddy perimeter roads that skirted the edge of the swamp. These were rough, rutted trails, barely passable in places. Her headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled roots and the Spanish moss hanging like specters from the trees. Every few hundred yards, she stopped, leaning hard on the horn. The sound blared out, a desperate artificial intrusion into the wilderness. She waited after each blast, listening, hoping for an answering shout, the rumble of an engine. Nothing returned but the echo of her own fear. As investigators later reconstructed the day, they learned the morning had begun with the promise of a perfect father-son outing. Juniper had dropped them off at this same launch just before dawn. Willard was an avid duck hunter, passionate about the sport and the environment. He was eager to share this tradition with Thatcher, even at such a young age. Both were dressed in full camouflage, Thatcher bundled in a tiny jacket and a blue knit beanie. Willard had packed his usual gear, including his most prized possession, a Krieghoff shotgun. It was an expensive, high-performance firearm, a centerpiece of his collection, and his preferred weapon for duck hunting. Juniper had housework to manage, so she had left them to their day, kissing them both goodbye as Willard prepared the boat. By 10 p.m., the reality of the situation became unbearable. The silence from the swamp was no longer just unsettling. It was terrifying. Juniper drove to the nearest town and contacted the local sheriff's department. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation, the words catching in her throat. Willard and Thatcher Kincaid were officially reported missing. When asked for a recent photograph, Juniper provided an image that captured the essence of their bond. It showed Willard, smiling warmly, holding a laughing Thatcher in his lap. They were surrounded by tall, dry reeds, bathed in sunlight. Juniper clarified that the photo was not taken that day, but on a similar hunting trip a few weeks prior. It was a snapshot of joy, now transformed into a haunting symbol of loss. As the official machinery of a missing persons case began to turn, the search for the missing father and son plunged into the darkness of the Mississippi swamps. By dawn on November 15th, the remote boat launch was transformed from a place of quiet anticipation into a bustling command center. The disappearance of a father and his infant son triggered an immediate, large-scale response. The Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks joined the local sheriff's department, bringing specialized equipment and intimate knowledge of the treacherous terrain. The urgency was palpable. The vulnerability of a 1-year-old child exposed to the elements created a ticking clock that loomed over the entire operation. The environment itself was the primary adversary. The swamps were not a single body of water, but a complex, confusing network of lakes, bayous, narrow channels, and flooded forests. It was a landscape where one could get lost within minutes of leaving the main waterways, a maze of green and brown where the line between land and water blurred into an impenetrable wilderness. The initial focus was entirely on rescue. The prevailing theory was that Willard had experienced engine trouble, become stranded, or perhaps suffered a medical emergency. Airboats, with their massive fans generating a deafening roar, were deployed first. They skimmed over the shallow, vegetation-choked waters where conventional boats couldn't navigate. The sound echoed through the cypress stands as search teams, bundled against the morning chill, began the methodical process of grid-searching the sectors where Willard was known to hunt. The airboats moved in formation, their powerful lights cutting through the early morning mist. The searchers scanned the banks, the reeds, the surface of the water, looking for any sign of the Kincaids. A piece of clothing, a floating decoy, an overturned boat. The tension was thick, every shadow scrutinized, every ripple in the water analyzed. Simultaneously, helicopters flew low overhead, utilizing thermal imaging cameras, hoping to detect heat signatures against the cold, damp landscape. On the ground, K-9 units attempted to track scents along the embankments and islands, but the damp, muddy environment made tracking difficult, the overwhelming organic odors of the swamp confusing the dogs. The searchers battled the environment at every turn. Thick mud sucked at their boots, threatening to trap them. Dense reeds obscured visibility, creating a claustrophobic sense of enclosure. The constant awareness of the swamp's inhabitants, alligators lurking beneath the surface, venomous snakes coiled in the underbrush, added an undercurrent of danger to the already perilous operation. They called out for Willard and Thatcher, their voices strained against the vast indifference of the landscape. Juniper remained at the command center, a solitary figure wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the water. Every communication from the search teams, every returning boat, brought a surge of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The reports were consistently negative. No debris, no gear, no sign of the missing father and son. It was as if the swamp had simply absorbed them. The operation continued relentlessly through the first day and into the second. The urgency mounted as the window for survival, particularly for young Thatcher, began to close. The weather was turning colder, the nights dipping into temperatures that posed a significant risk of hypothermia. On the afternoon of November 16th, 2 days into the search, the complexion of the case changed entirely. A team of fish and wildlife agents was exploring an adjacent sector, slightly removed from Willard's primary hunting area. This sector was accessible by a seldom-used service road, a rutted track that ran along a raised embankment. It was during this methodical sweep that they made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the entire operation. A deputy spotted a vehicle parked off the service road, partially obscured by brush. It wasn't Willard's truck, Juniper had that, but a marked patrol vehicle. The sight of it, seemingly abandoned in this remote area, immediately set off alarms. The search team approached the vehicle cautiously, their senses heightened, the routine nature of the search replaced by a sudden alertness. The vehicle was locked, and there was no one inside. A quick check of the license plate identified the vehicle as belonging to Officer Odelia Vancroft, a well-respected member of the local police force. The confusion was immediate. Why was an officer's car abandoned here in the middle of a massive missing persons search? A frantic, localized search began immediately. The command center was notified, and resources were diverted to the area. The atmosphere shifted from a focused search and rescue to something far more ominous. The uncertainty surrounding the Kincaids was now compounded by the disappearance of a police officer. The team fanned out from the patrol car, moving into the dense reeds and shallow water along the embankment. The terrain was difficult, requiring the officers to wade through knee-deep mud, the water cold against their skin. The silence of the swamp seemed to deepen, the tension mounting with every step. It didn't take long. About 50 yards from the vehicle, hidden within a thick stand of reeds, they found her. Officer Odelia Vancroft was dead. The discovery was a brutal blow to the assembled law enforcement personnel. The search for the Kincaids was immediately suspended as the area was secured as a crime scene. The initial examination of the scene was harrowing. Officer Vancroft had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. She was still in uniform, her service weapon holstered. It appeared she had been taken completely by surprise, the attack sudden and overwhelming. Homicide investigators arrived and began the meticulous process of documenting the scene. The nature of the wounds was immediately apparent. They were not caused by a rifle or a handgun, but by pellets fired from a shotgun, the exact type of firearm used by duck hunters throughout the swamp, and the exact type of firearm Willard Kincaid had carried with him. The implication was immediate and devastating. The timeline placed Officer Vancroft's death very close to the time the Kincaids disappeared. The location was geographically proximate. The weapon type matched. Investigators scrambled to understand why Officer Vancroft had been in that remote sector. Her patrol logs provided the answer. She was not involved in the Kincaid search. She was on routine patrol. Specifically, she had been dispatched to that area following several recent complaints about illegal dumping. The swamps, with their isolation and lack of oversight, were often targeted by individuals and companies looking to dispose of waste illicitly. Her log indicated she had arrived in the area but made no subsequent radio contact. There was no indication she had called for backup or reported anything suspicious. The investigation now faced a horrific duality. Were the missing hunters and the murdered officer connected? The evidence pointed toward a grim scenario. Had Willard Kincaid, for some inexplicable reason, murdered a police officer? And if so, what had happened to his son? The discovery created an agonizing dilemma. If Willard was the perpetrator, the search was no longer a rescue mission, but a manhunt. But this theory didn't sit right with many who knew him. Willard was known as a dedicated family man and a responsible hunter with no history of violence or mental instability. Juniper Kincaid was devastated by the news of Officer Vancroft's death, but she vehemently rejected the emerging suspicion surrounding her husband. She insisted to investigators that Willard was incapable of such violence. The idea that he would murder someone, especially a police officer, while his infant son was with him, was inconceivable to her. She pleaded with authorities to continue looking for them as victims, not perpetrators. Despite her pleas, the reality of the evidence forced the investigation to consider Willard as a primary suspect. His experience in the swamp could explain how he was evading capture. But the mystery deepened. If he had committed murder, why? What could have triggered such a violent act? And where was Thatcher? The swamp held the answers, but it offered no easy clues. The investigation expanded, now encompassing a homicide and a missing persons case that seemed inextricably linked, the truth obscured by the murky waters and the dense reeds. The dual investigation struggled to gain traction. The crime scene where Officer Vancroft was found yielded little forensic evidence beyond the shotgun pellets. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to definitively identify the shooter. The search for the Kincaids also stalled. The massive effort, despite covering vast areas of the swamp, found no trace of them, their boat, or any of their gear. The absence of evidence was baffling, fueling the speculation surrounding Willard's involvement, while simultaneously providing no concrete proof. As weeks turned into months, the leads dried up. The initial urgency faded, replaced by a grinding frustration. The case, despite its shocking elements, gradually went cold. Juniper Kincaid was left in an agonizing limbo, mourning the loss of her family, while simultaneously defending her husband's name against the unspoken accusations that hung over the investigation. The mystery of what happened in the swamps that November day remained unsolved, a dark stain on the quiet community. 2 years passed. The Kincaid disappearance and the murder of Officer Vancroft became one of the region's most confounding cold cases. The theories remain just that, theories. The swamp kept its secrets. In November 2017, exactly 2 years after the incident, the break in the case came not from a renewed investigative effort, but from an entirely unrelated routine maintenance job deep within the swamp system. Rhett Gable was an industrial diver, a man who made his living in environments most people actively avoided. He specialized in underwater infrastructure contracted by a telecommunications company to inspect and maintain a network of fiber optic cables that ran through the Mississippi swamp system. It was specialized, often dangerous work, requiring him to navigate the murky depths, relying on his equipment and experience to work in near-zero visibility. On this particular day, Rhett was preparing for a dive in a deep channel of the swamp system, miles away from the area where Officer Vancroft had been found and where the initial search for the Kincaids had been concentrated. The water was a murky greenish yellow, the surface reflecting the overcast sky. Rhett donned his heavy dive suit and helmet, the weight pressing down on him. He checked his equipment meticulously, his air supply, his communication lines, his underwater camera rig. The camera was essential, used to document his work and the condition of the cables in the unforgiving environment. He descended into the murky water, the world above disappearing as the greenish-yellow haze enveloped him. The sunlight filtered down from the surface, creating an eerie, diffused glow. Visibility was limited to a few feet, forcing him to rely on his dive light to cut through the gloom. The environment underwater was otherworldly. The bottom was covered in thick sediment, decaying vegetation, and the submerged roots of cypress trees. Small particles of organic matter floated in the water, catching the beam of his light like dust motes in a sunbeam. Rhett moved slowly and methodically along the cable line, his breathing a rhythmic sound in the otherwise silent underwater world. The pressure of the water was a constant presence, the isolation complete. He was checking a section of cable that had shown minor signal degradation when his equipment bumped against something large and solid buried in the sediment. It wasn't a log or a rock. The shape was too regular, too artificial. The impact stirred up a cloud of mud, temporarily obscuring his vision. Rhett stopped his forward movement and directed his light toward the object. He waited for the sediment to settle, the shape gradually emerging from the gloom. He used his gloved hands to clear away some of the mud and algae that covered it. It was a large, black hardshell case. He recognized the shape immediately. It was a gun case. The exterior was covered in a thick layer of grime, indicating it had been submerged for a significant amount of time. Curiosity piqued, Rhett examined the case. It was heavy-duty construction designed to protect its contents from the elements. He maneuvered it out of the sediment, the effort straining his muscles. He checked the latches. They were unsecured. He opened the case. The sight that greeted him was startling, a stark contrast to the monotonous landscape of the swamp floor. The inside of the case featured a custom-molded interior with precise cutouts. Lying within these cutouts were the disassembled parts of a shotgun. Despite the murky water and the layer of algae that coated everything, the quality of the firearm was immediately apparent. The wooden stock and fore-end had a polished finish, the craftsmanship undeniable. Rhett knew a thing or two about hunting. It was a common pastime in the region. He leaned closer, his light illuminating the brand name printed along the barrel assembly. Krieghoff. This wasn't just any shotgun. It was a high-end, expensive weapon, costing thousands of dollars. The discovery struck him as profoundly strange. Why would someone dump such a valuable firearm in the middle of the swamp? Accidents happened. Hunters sometimes lost gear overboard. But this shotgun was carefully packed inside its case. It hadn't been dropped accidentally. It had been deliberately disposed of. Rhett documented the find with his underwater camera, capturing the image of the open case resting on the swamp bottom, the Krieghoff nestled within, an artifact of violence emerging from the murky depths. He then made the decision to retrieve it. The weight of the case, filled with water, and the heavy firearm made the ascent difficult, but he managed to surface with the discovery. Back on the dive boat, Rhett examined the Krieghoff more closely. The realization that he held a potentially significant piece of evidence began to settle in. Initially, the temptation to keep the firearm was strong. It was a valuable find, and the chances of it being traced back to its owner seemed slim. He took the case home, planning to clean and restore the shotgun. However, when he showed the discovery to his wife, Alyssa, her reaction was immediate and cautionary. She recognized the potential implications of a discarded weapon found in the swamps. The story of the missing hunters and the murdered officer was well known in the community. She voiced her concern that the shotgun might be the missing piece of that puzzle. The idea that he might be withholding crucial evidence troubled Rhett. After a lengthy discussion, Alyssa convinced him that the only responsible course of action was to turn it in to the authorities. Rhett contacted the sheriff's department and reported his find. He provided them with the shotgun and the underwater footage he had captured. The authorities immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery. They began the process of tracing the firearm. The serial number was clearly visible on the receiver. A quick search of the National Firearms Registry yielded a match. The Krieghoff shotgun belonged to Willard Kincaid. The discovery instantly reignited the cold case. After 2 years of silence, a tangible piece of evidence had emerged. The news was relayed to Juniper Kincaid, bringing a fresh wave of anguish and confusion. The discovery of the shotgun confirmed that something terrible had happened in the swamp, but it offered no answers as to the fate of her husband and son. The investigation was back on, now focused on the weapon that had seemingly materialized from the abyss. The discovery of Willard Kincaid's Krieghoff shotgun injected a surge of energy into the investigation, providing the first significant lead in 2 years. The central question that now dominated the inquiry was stark and unavoidable. Was this the weapon used to murder Officer Odelia Vancroft? The implications of the answer would shape the entire narrative of the case, either confirming Willard as the perpetrator or suggesting a far more complex scenario. The shotgun was immediately transferred to the State Crime Lab for detailed forensic analysis. Investigators waited anxiously for the results, hoping for a definitive ballistic match that would finally break the case wide open. The anticipation was high, the atmosphere in the investigation unit charged with the expectation of a breakthrough. However, the reality of shotgun forensics quickly tempered the initial optimism. Shotguns, unlike rifles or handguns, do not leave unique microscopic markings, striations, on the projectiles they fire. The smooth bore of the shotgun barrel does not impart the same kind of individualized signature on the pellets. The pellets recovered from Officer Vancroft's body were a common shot type, standard birdshot used for duck hunting throughout the region. While the gauge of the pellets was consistent with the Krieghoff, a direct ballistic match was impossible. The crime lab could confirm that the Krieghoff could have fired the fatal shots, but they could not confirm that it did, to the exclusion of all other shotguns of the same gauge. This ballistic impasse was a significant setback. The investigation was left with the same ambiguity that had plagued it from the beginning. The discovery of the gun, while dramatic and unexpected, did not resolve the central mystery. It simply deepened it. Furthermore, the condition and location of the gun raised new, troubling questions. The Krieghoff was found miles away from the crime scene, where Officer Vancroft was murdered, in a deep channel far from the area where the Kincaids were hunting. And it was found carefully disassembled and packed inside its custom case. This suggested a deliberate and methodical disposal, not the actions of someone fleeing in a panic after committing a violent crime. If Willard had murdered the officer in a sudden confrontation, why would he take the time to break down his shotgun, secure it in its case, and transport it miles away before dumping it? It seemed inconsistent with the narrative of a desperate fugitive. The ambiguity forced investigators to reconsider alternative theories. If Willard hadn't killed the officer, then who did? And why was his gun discarded in the swamp? The possibility that a third party was involved, that Willard and Thatcher were also victims, began to gain traction. The investigation pivoted back to the original reason Officer Vancroft was in the area: illegal dumping. While the initial inquiries into local dumping activities had yielded nothing, the investigators decided to take a harder, more aggressive look. The swamps provided ample opportunity for illicit disposal of waste, and the people involved in such activities might be motivated to use violence to protect their operations. Their focus narrowed on a local construction company that had been the subject of numerous environmental complaints over the years. The company, owned by a man known for his aggressive business practices and blatant disregard for regulations, was suspected of illegally disposing of hazardous waste, including asbestos, chemical solvents, and contaminated soil, in the remote sectors of the swamps to avoid the significant costs of proper disposal. Investigators theorized that Officer Vancroft might have stumbled upon an active dumping operation and been murdered to ensure her silence. If this was the case, the Kincaid disappearance might be entirely unrelated, a tragic coincidence of timing and location. Or perhaps Willard and Thatcher had also witnessed the dumping and met the same fate. The evidence against the construction company mounted. Satellite imagery showed suspicious activity in the area around the time of the incident. Heavy trucks moving into the remote service roads late at night. Financial records indicated significant discrepancies in their waste disposal costs, suggesting they were diverting materials from authorized disposal sites. Former employees spoke of a culture of intimidation and secrecy within the company. Convinced they had identified the perpetrators, the investigators prepared to execute a search warrant. The raid on the construction company's yard was a high-stakes operation planned with meticulous precision. The company owner had a reputation for confrontation, and investigators anticipated resistance. Early one morning, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles, including tactical teams armed with specialized equipment, descended on the property. The atmosphere was tense, the adrenaline high as the officers prepared to breach the gates. The raid was executed swiftly and aggressively. The officers secured the premises, detaining the employees present. The company owner emerged from his office, immediately aggressive and belligerent. He demanded to know the reason for the intrusion, shouting threats and obscenities, attempting to obstruct the search. He was detained while the search teams began their work. The search of the property was extensive, covering the warehouses, the storage containers, and the heavy machinery. Investigators discovered significant evidence of environmental violations. Drums of unlabeled chemicals were found improperly stored, leaking into the ground. Piles of asbestos-containing materials were found hidden in a remote corner of the yard. The evidence was sufficient to shut down the operation and press serious environmental charges. The tension peaked when investigators entered the owner's private office. There, displayed prominently on a rack, were several shotguns. The sight of the weapons seemed to confirm their theory. If these were the weapons used to kill Officer Vancroft, the case was solved. The owner was an avid hunter, and the presence of the firearms provided the missing link. The shotguns were immediately seized and sent for forensic analysis. The investigators waited anxiously for the results, confident that they had found the breakthrough they needed. The narrative seemed clear. The construction company, caught in the act of illegal dumping, had murdered the officer and possibly the Kincaids to cover their tracks. However, the results brought the investigation crashing back to reality. The analysis confirmed that none of the shotguns seized from the construction company were involved in the Vancroft murder. The gauges and shot types did not match the evidence recovered from the scene. The construction company raid, while successful in uncovering illegal activities, was a dead end in the homicide investigation. The illegal dumping was entirely unrelated to the violence. It was merely the circumstance that had placed Officer Vancroft in the area, a tragic intersection of routine patrol and deadly intent. The investigation was back at square one. The Krieghoff shotgun remained the only tangible link to the events of that day, but its story remained elusive. The frustration among the investigators was palpable. They had pursued a promising lead with intensity, only to find themselves further entangled in the mysteries of the swamp. The case seemed determined to resist resolution, the truth buried as deeply as the shotgun had been in the murky depths. The failure of the construction company lead left the investigation drifting in a sea of uncertainty. The momentum gained from the discovery of the Krieghoff shotgun had dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of frustration. Months passed after the raid, and the initial excitement faded. The case seemed cursed, characterized by dramatic discoveries that ultimately led nowhere, an endless cycle of hope and disappointment. The investigators were desperate for a new angle, something that would break the stalemate and provide a clear direction. In mid-2018, nearly 3 years after the disappearance and murder, the lead investigator decided to look beyond conventional investigative techniques. The traditional methods, interviews, forensic analysis, following the evidence trail, had yielded nothing conclusive. The realization dawned that the swamp itself was the primary witness, and perhaps it held clues that had been overlooked, hidden not in the physical evidence, but in the environmental record. This unconventional approach led him to consult with a university research team that had been conducting a long-term study on the hydrology of the swamp system. Their research focused on the intricate dynamics of the ecosystem, water levels, salinity, the impact of environmental changes on the delicate balance of the wetlands. To conduct this research, the team had deployed a network of remote sensors positioned throughout the waterways, continuously recording environmental data. These sensors, silent sentinels, monitoring the rhythms of the swamp, had been active in 2015, their data archived in the university servers. The investigator met with the lead hydrologist, a man whose expertise lay in the complex language of water movement and sediment transport. He explained the parameters of the case, the geographical areas of interest, and the critical time frame. He asked if the archived data logs from November 2015 might reveal any anomalies, anything unusual that occurred in the swamp around the time of the incident. The research team, intrigued by the possibility of applying their data to a criminal investigation, agreed to analyze the archives. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the processing of millions of data points from dozens of sensors. They used sophisticated algorithms to filter the data, looking for deviations from the normal environmental patterns, spikes in activity that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena, such as weather events or tidal flows. The analysis took weeks, a meticulous sifting through the digital noise of the swamp's environment. The researchers cross-referenced the data from multiple sensors, looking for correlations and patterns. The breakthrough came not from the sensors located near the crime scene or the primary search areas, but from a sensor positioned in a remote, rarely accessed sector of the swamp. The data revealed a highly unusual localized anomaly recorded late on the night of November 14, 2015, hours after the Kincaids vanished and Officer Vancroft was likely murdered. The anomaly was a significant spike in water turbidity, the measure of water cloudiness caused by suspended sediment. The spike was sharp, intense, and relatively short-lived, indicating a sudden, powerful disturbance of the swamp floor. The hydrologists interpreted the data. The turbidity spike was not caused by natural phenomena. The intensity and pattern of the disturbance were consistent with a motorized boat being launched or retrieved hastily during the night, its propeller churning up significant sediment from the shallow bottom. This was highly suspicious. Normal hunting activity ceased at dusk, and the initial search efforts had not yet reached this remote area. The data suggested clandestine activity in the dead of night, movement under the cover of darkness. This environmental evidence provided the first indication of activity in the swamp after the incident, suggesting a cover-up or an escape route that had been entirely overlooked. The location of the anomaly was crucial, a remote, rarely used boat access point situated between the crime scene and the location where the Krieghoff was eventually found. The investigators immediately focused on this remote access point. It was an isolated area, accessible by a narrow, overgrown trail, a place where someone could operate without being detected. A specialized police dive team was dispatched to the location. The conditions were daunting. The access point was shallow near the shore, but dropped off quickly into a deeper channel. The water was dark and murky, the visibility near zero, even worse than the conditions Rhett Gable had faced. The dive team conducted a systematic search of the bottom near the access point. They worked primarily by touch, their hands sweeping through the thick mud, searching for anything out of the ordinary. The task was painstaking and slow, the divers operating in a world of darkness and silence, connected to the surface by their air hoses and the shared determination to find the truth. Their efforts yielded a crucial discovery. Preserved in the anaerobic mud of the swamp bed, an environment devoid of oxygen that slows decomposition and erosion, they found distinct tire tracks. The tracks indicated a heavy vehicle, and a trailer had backed down the access point and into the water. The depth and pattern of the tracks confirmed the hydrologist's interpretation. A boat had been launched or retrieved here. The discovery of the tire tracks confirmed that someone had been active at this location, providing a potential link between the crime scene and the disposal of the shotgun. But the identity of the individuals involved remained unknown. The tracks themselves could not be traced back to a specific vehicle. The dive team continued their search, expanding the perimeter around the tire tracks. They began the meticulous process of microevidence recovery, sifting through the mud and sediment, looking for anything, however small, that might have been left behind. This was a search not for large objects, but for the small, easily overlooked traces of human activity. The conditions made the search grueling. The divers worked in shifts, their movements restricted by the heavy gear and the enveloping darkness. They collected bags of sediment for later analysis, but they also searched for visible objects, their gloved fingers probing the mud with delicate precision. It was during one of these methodical sweeps that a diver found it. Embedded in the mud near the tire tracks was a small, discarded piece of plastic. It was easily overlooked, resembling a piece of trash, a fragment of the ubiquitous pollution that plagued the waterways. But the diver recognized it as something specific. He surfaced with the object, the small piece of plastic clutched in his hand. It was a plastic wrapper, the kind used for packaging small specialized items. The labeling was partially degraded by the long submersion, but enough remained visible to identify the product. It was the packaging for a specialized type of shotgun choke tube, a device inserted into the barrel of a shotgun to control the spread of the pellets. This wasn't just any choke tube, it was a niche, expensive product designed for high-performance hunting and competition shooting, favored by serious hunters seeking to maximize the efficiency of their weapons. Investigators immediately checked Willard Kincaid's known hunting gear, meticulously cataloged by Juniper. He used high-quality equipment, but he did not use this specific brand or type of choke tube. The Krieghoff was equipped with standard factory chokes. The realization was immediate and profound. This piece of evidence, this discarded wrapper, likely belonged to the perpetrators. After years of ambiguity and frustration, the investigation finally had a tangible clue that pointed away from Willard Kincaid and toward unknown assailants. The choke tube wrapper, a seemingly insignificant piece of trash preserved in the mud, became the key to unraveling the mystery. The investigation now shifted focus, moving from the murky depths of the swamp to the specialized world of high-end hunting gear, searching for the individuals who had purchased this specific product. The discovery of the choke tube wrapper provided the investigation with a narrow, focused avenue of inquiry. This was no longer a broad search across the vast swamps, but a precise hunt for the purchasers of a very specific item. The niche nature of the product was the key. This was not a common accessory found in every hunter's gear bag. The specialized choke tube was a high-end product, manufactured by a company known for its precision engineering and used primarily by competitive shooters and serious hunters willing to invest significant money in optimizing their equipment. Investigators contacted the manufacturer, tracing the distribution network of this specific model. They learned that it was only sold at a few exclusive hunting outfitters within the state, stores that catered to a specialized clientele. The authorities began the painstaking process of reviewing sales records from these outfitters. They focused on the weeks leading up to the incident in November 2015, looking for purchases of that specific choke tube model. The task was complicated by the passage of time and the varying record-keeping practices of the stores. Some of the smaller outfitters kept handwritten ledgers, and not all purchases were tracked with detailed customer information. They searched for both credit card transactions and cash sales, aware that individuals involved in illicit activities often preferred the anonymity of cash. However, persistence paid off. At one of the larger outfitters, they found a match. The records indicated that the specific choke tube had been purchased shortly before the disappearance. The purchase was traced back to two men who had bought the item together, Ignatius Iggy Novak and Melvin Stover. The names were not immediately familiar to the investigators. Novak and Stover were known figures in the local hunting community, respected for their skill and their expensive equipment. They had no significant criminal records and had never been considered persons of interest in the Kincaid or Vancroft cases. They had been briefly interviewed during the initial canvass of local hunters, a routine procedure that had yielded no actionable intelligence. Their alibis, that they were hunting in a different sector of the swamp on that day, had checked out, and there was nothing to connect them to the incident. With the discovery of the choke tube wrapper linking them to the remote access point, investigators began a deep dive into the backgrounds of Novak and Stover. They uncovered a hidden world beneath the veneer of respectable hunters. They learned that the two men were suspected of engaging in illegal commercial hunting, a lucrative black market trade involving the large-scale poaching of ducks and other wildlife for sale to unscrupulous restaurants and distributors. This revelation provided a powerful, compelling motive for the murder of Officer Vancroft. Illegal commercial hunting was a serious crime, carrying significant fines and potential jail time. The scale of their operation, suggested by the rumors and their investment in specialized equipment like the choke tubes, meant they had a lot to lose. If Officer Vancroft had stumbled upon their operation, they might have been motivated to use deadly force to protect their illicit business and their freedom. The investigation also learned that Novak and Stover had abruptly stopped their large-scale hunting activities after the 2015 season. They still hunted recreationally, maintaining a low profile within the community, but the rumors of their commercial operations ceased. This sudden change in behavior, coinciding perfectly with the murders, was highly suspicious. It suggested a realization that the risk had become too great, the scrutiny too intense. In late 2018, authorities placed Novak and Stover under intense surveillance. They needed direct evidence linking them to the murders, something more than a choke tube purchase and suspicious behavior. They deployed teams of undercover officers, monitored their movements, their communications, their financial transactions, hoping one of them would make a mistake, reveal a clue, or lead them to the evidence. The surveillance was difficult and resource-intensive. Novak and Stover were cautious, displaying a level of awareness that suggested experience in evading detection. They lived quiet lives, avoiding attention and sticking to routine patterns. They used encrypted communication methods, making it difficult to intercept their conversations. The surveillance dragged on for weeks, yielding little actionable intelligence. The suspects seemed unnervingly calm, confident in the security of their secrets. The break came from an unexpected source, a stroke of luck that shattered the stalemate. Investigators decided to contact the outfitter again, asking follow-up questions about the choke tube purchase. They wanted to confirm the details of the transaction, hoping to glean any additional information about Novak and Stover's behavior during the purchase, any seemingly insignificant detail that might provide leverage. The outfitter, unaware of the significance of the inquiry, cooperated fully. He remembered the purchase. Novak was a regular customer, known for buying high-end gear. The interaction seemed entirely routine. However, a few days later, Novak visited the outfitter again to buy ammunition. During the casual conversation, the outfitter mentioned the police inquiry. He didn't do it maliciously, just making small talk, a casual remark about the thoroughness of the police investigation. He mentioned that the police had been asking about the specialized choke tube Novak had purchased back in 2015. The impact of this casual remark was immediate and dramatic. The surveillance team monitoring the store observed Novak's reaction. His demeanor changed instantly. The calm facade cracked, replaced by a visible agitation. He abruptly ended the conversation, his movements hurried and erratic, and left the store. The surveillance team reported his reaction to the command center. The realization hit the investigators. Novak was panicking. He knew the investigation was closing in on the choke tube purchase, the one piece of evidence that could link him to the murders, a detail he thought was safely buried in the mud of the swamp. Novak got into his truck and began driving erratically. He wasn't heading home. He was driving away from the town, his speed increasing as he reached the open roads. He was heading toward a remote area of dense pine forest, far from the swamps where the initial crimes occurred. A different landscape entirely, characterized by rolling hills and thick woodland. The chase was on. The surveillance team followed him, maintaining a safe distance, but ensuring he did not evade them. The pursuit continued for miles, moving deeper into the isolated woodland. The tension mounted with every mile. What was Novak doing? Where was he going? The anticipation was electric, the realization that the case was finally breaking wide open. Novak finally stopped in a secluded area of the pine forest, a place accessible only by a narrow, overgrown logging road. He got out of his truck, his movements frantic. He grabbed a shovel from the bed and moved quickly into the trees, disappearing into the dense underbrush. The surveillance team reported his actions. They realized he was not just hiding. He was attempting to recover or move evidence. Convinced that he was about to destroy crucial evidence, the investigators ordered the tactical teams positioned nearby as part of the operation to move in. The confrontation happened quickly. The tactical teams, armed and armored, emerged from the woods, converging on Novak's location. They moved silently, their training evident in their coordinated approach. They found Novak in a small clearing, the ground covered in pine needles. He was digging frantically, the shovel biting into the earth with desperate energy. "Police! Drop the shovel! Hands in the air!" The shouts shattered the silence of the forest. Novak froze, the shovel falling from his hands. He looked around wildly, realizing he was trapped. A tense standoff ensued. Novak, his face pale with fear and desperation, hesitated, his eyes darting between the officers and the partially disturbed earth at his feet. For a moment, it seemed he might resist, might fight back. But the overwhelming presence of the tactical team convinced him of the futility of resistance. He slowly raised his hands and surrendered. He was subdued and arrested. The area where Novak was digging was immediately secured as a crime scene. The shovel lay embedded in the disturbed earth, marking the spot where Novak had desperately tried to conceal the truth. The investigators knew with chilling certainty that they had finally found the answers they had been searching for. The climax of the 3-year investigation had culminated in this remote pine forest, the silence broken by the shouts of the officers and the realization that the horrific mystery was about to be unraveled. As Ignatius Novak was being taken into custody in the pine forest, the operation continued with synchronized precision. A simultaneous arrest warrant was executed at the residence of Melvin Stover. A second tactical team descended on his home, taking him into custody without incident. Stover was found seemingly unaware of Novak's panicked actions and the rapidly unfolding events that were sealing their fate. Both men were transported to the sheriff's department and placed in separate interrogation rooms. The atmosphere in the investigation unit was charged with a mixture of relief and grim anticipation. They had the suspects, the motive, and the circumstantial evidence of the choke tube and Novak's desperate attempt to dig up something in the woods. But they needed a confession to fully understand the horrific events of November 2015 and to ensure a conviction. The interrogation of Novak was met with stony silence. He was defiant and uncooperative, denying any involvement in the murders and offering no explanation for his actions in the pine forest. He maintained his composure, his demeanor cold and calculating, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He requested a lawyer and refused to answer any further questions. The interrogation of Stover, however, took a different turn. Stover was the weaker link, the one more susceptible to the psychological pressure of the interrogation. He was initially hesitant, clearly frightened by the sudden arrest and the gravity of the situation. The investigators pressed him, employing techniques designed to exploit his fear and uncertainty. They emphasized the seriousness of the charges, multiple counts of murder, including the murder of a police officer and a child, and the weight of the evidence against them. They detailed the discovery of the choke tube wrapper, the traced purchase linking him and Novak to the specialized equipment, and the surveillance that had captured Novak's panicked reaction. They painted a picture of an airtight case, a narrative of guilt that left little room for doubt. The turning point came when the investigators informed Stover that Novak had been arrested while attempting to dig up evidence in the pine forest. The revelation that his partner, the man who had orchestrated their criminal enterprise and the subsequent cover-up, had panicked and led the police directly to the concealed evidence shattered Stover's resolve. He realized the game was up. The prospect of facing a life sentence or even the death penalty without cooperation was overwhelming. Melvin Stover confessed. The confession was detailed and harrowing, a chilling account of the sequence of events that led to the tragedy. Stover explained that he and Novak had been engaged in a large-scale illegal duck hunt for commercial profit. They were using illegal techniques, including electronic calls and baiting, to harvest hundreds of ducks which they planned to sell on the black market. Their operation was sophisticated and lucrative, utilizing the remote wilderness of the swamp to conceal their activities. On the morning of November 14, 2015, they were in the middle of their operation when Officer Odelia Vancroft, while investigating the reports of illegal dumping, coincidentally stumbled upon them. She had apparently heard the excessive shooting and electronic calls and came to investigate. When Officer Vancroft confronted them and attempted to arrest them, Novak reacted with sudden, brutal violence. He shot her without warning before she even had a chance to reach for her radio or her weapon. The murder was a spontaneous act of desperation to protect their illegal operation, a cold-blooded decision to eliminate the threat posed by the officer. The tragedy compounded shortly after. Willard Kincaid, having heard the gunshots and fearing a hunting accident, arrived at the scene to offer assistance. He stumbled upon the aftermath of the murder, a witness to their horrific crime. Seeing that Willard had witnessed the murder, they realized they could not let him live. They shot him as well, eliminating the only witness to their actions. The horror did not end there. After killing Willard, they searched his nearby hunting blind, looking for anything that might identify him or link them to the crime. There, they found 1-year-old Thatcher. The presence of the infant created a crisis. Panicked and unsure what to do, they took the boy with them. They couldn't leave him there to die of exposure or to be found by searchers, which would immediately trigger a massive investigation focused on the area. They then began the elaborate process of covering up their crimes. They took Willard's Krieghoff shotgun, realizing that if it was found near the crime scene, it might confuse the investigation and suggest Willard was the perpetrator. They later disassembled the shotgun, packed it in its case, and dumped it in a remote channel miles away, hoping it would never be found. That night, under the cover of darkness, they used their boat, triggering the turbidity sensor that would eventually betray them, to transport Willard's body. They navigated to a deep area of the swamp known for a high concentration of large alligators. They weighted the body down and dumped it, ensuring that his remains would not be found. The environmental conditions and the activity of the alligators explained why Willard's body had never been recovered. The fate of Thatcher Kincaid was the most agonizing part of the confession. Stover revealed that they kept the boy for several days, hiding him at a remote cabin they used for their poaching operations. They debated what to do with him, realizing the immense risk of keeping him alive. Fearing that the boy might eventually identify them or that their continued care for him would lead to their discovery, Novak eventually made the cold, calculated decision to kill him. Novak took Thatcher to the dense pine forest, the same location where he was eventually arrested, and murdered him. He buried the small body in a shallow grave, hoping the remote location and the passage of time would conceal the crime forever. The confession provided the answers that Juniper Kincaid had been searching for, but they were more horrific than she could have imagined. Her husband and son were not lost in the swamp. They were the victims of a brutal, senseless act of violence. Armed with Stover's confession, investigators immediately mobilized to the site where Novak had been apprehended. The area was secured, and a forensic team began the meticulous processes of excavating the site where Novak had been digging. The excavation was conducted with somber precision. The disturbed earth marked the spot, and as they dug deeper, the horrifying truth was confirmed. They located the small, skeletal remains of a child. The remains were carefully recovered and sent for forensic analysis. The identification was confirmed through DNA testing. The remains belonged to Thatcher Kincaid. The discovery of the grave provided the final, devastating confirmation of Stover's confession. The recovery of Thatcher Kincaid's remains from the shallow grave in the pine forest, the very spot where Ignatius Novak had desperately tried to move them, provided the final devastating confirmation of Melvin Stover's confession. This physical evidence solidified the case against the two men, eliminating any ambiguity surrounding the fates of Willard, Thatcher, and Officer Vancroft. For Juniper Kincaid, the discovery ended years of agonizing uncertainty, replacing the nightmare of the unknown with the brutal reality of calculated murder. The confirmation that Willard was a victim, a good Samaritan who had tried to help, cleared his name of the suspicion that had haunted the investigation for years. Ignatius Novak and Melvin Stover were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Officer Odelia Vancroft, Willard Kincaid, and Thatcher Kincaid. In addition, they faced numerous severe wildlife violations related to their illegal commercial poaching operation, the very activity that set the tragic events in motion. The trials were swift, the evidence overwhelming. Stover's detailed confession, corroborated by the physical evidence, the choke tube wrapper, the environmental data, and the recovery of Thatcher's remains, left no room for doubt. Both men were found guilty on all counts. The crimes, committed simply to protect an illegal poaching operation and escalated through an increasingly horrific attempt to eliminate witnesses, resulted in sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. While Willard Kincaid's body was never recovered from the depths of the Mississippi swamps, the unexpected discovery of his discarded Krieghoff shotgun by a commercial diver ultimately unraveled the complex chain of violence and deception that began during the 2015 hunting season.